Strategies for acquiring social intelligence. We must, however, acknowledge that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, which has penetrated to the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exhalated powers, man still bears in his body-like frame the inevitable stamp of his lovely origin. Charles Darwin. In dealing with people, you will often encounter particular problems that will lend to make you emotional and lock you into the naive perspective. Such problems include unexpected political battles, superficial judgments of your character based on appearances, or pretty-minded criticisms of your work. The following essential strategies developed by masters past and present will help you meet these inevitable challenges and maintain the rational mindset necessary for social intelligence. Number 1. Speak through your work. A. In 1846, a 28-year-old Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis began to work as an assistant in the obstetrics department of the University of Vienna, and almost from the beginning he was a man obsessed. The great disease that plagued maternity wards in Europe at the time was that of childbed fever. At the hospital where young Semmelweis worked, 1 in 6 mothers died of the disease shortly after giving birth. When their bodies were dissected, doctors would discover the same whitish pus that smelled horrifically and an unusual amount of putrid flesh. Seeing the effect of the disease on almost a daily basis, Semmelweis could think of nothing else. He would devote his time to solving the riddle and its origins. At the time, the most common explanation for the cause of the disease revolved around the idea that airborne particles ingested through the lungs brought on the fever. But to Semmelweis, this made no sense. The epidemics of childbed fever did not seem to depend on weather, atmospheric conditions, or anything in the air. He noted, as he did a few others, that the incidence was much higher among women who had their babies delivered by a doctor as opposite to a midwife. Nobody could explain the reason for such a difference, and a few seemed perturbed by this. After much thinking and studying of the literature of the subject, Semmelweis came to this startling conclusion that it was the direct hand-to-hand contact between the doctor and the patient that caused the disease, a revolutionary concept at the time. As he was formulating this theory, an event occurred that seemed to prove it conclusively. The leader doctor in the department had been accidentally pricked in the finger by a knife while conducting an autopsy on a woman who had childbed fever, and the doctor died within a few days of massive infection. When they dissected his body, he had the same white pus and putrid flesh as the woman. It seemed clear to Semmelweis that in the autopsy of the room, the physician's hands became infected, and in the examining the woman and delivering their babies, they passed the disease into the woman's blood through various open wounds. The physicians were literally poisoning their patients with childbed fever. If this was the cause, it would have been simple to solve. Doctors would have to wash their hands and disinfect their hands before handling any patients. A practice no one followed in the hospital at that time. He instructed this practice in his ward, and the number of mortalities was instantly halved. On the brink of perhaps a major discovery in science, the connection between germs and contagious disease, Semmelweis seemed to be on his way to an illustrious career. But there was a problem. The head of the department, John Klein, was a most conservative gentleman who wanted his doctors to adhere to strict medical orthodoxies established by a previous practice. He believed that Semmelweis was an inexperienced doctor turned radical, wanted to overrun the establishment and make a name for himself in the process. Semmelweis argued with him increasingly over the subject of childbed fever, and when the young man finally promulgated this theory, Klein became furious. The implication was that doctors, including Klein himself, had been murdering their patients, and this was too much to take. Klein himself ascribed the lower number of mortalities in Semmelweis' ward to a new ventilation system he had installed. When in 1849 Semmelweis' assistantship was nearly in its end, Klein refused to renew it, essentially leaving the young man without a job. But now, however, Semmelweis had gained several key allies within the medical department, particularly among the younger set. They urged him to conduct some controlled experiments to strengthen his case, and then to write up his findings in a book that would spread his theory throughout Europe. Semmelweis, however, could not turn his attention away from the battle with Klein. Day by day his anger rose. Klein's adherence to a ridiculous and disproven theory about the fever was a criminal. Such blindsides to the truth made his blood boil. How could one man have such power in his field? Why should Semmelweis have to take so much of his time to do experiments and write books when the truth was already so apparent? He also expresses his scorn toward the close-mindedness of so many in the profession. Doctors from all over Europe attended Semmelweis' lectures. Although some remained skeptical, he won over more converts to his cause. His allies at the university pressed him to continue the momentum by doing more research and by writing a book on his theory. But within a few months of the lectures, the reasons no one could understand, Semmelweis suddenly left town and returned to his native Budapest, where he found the university and medical position that had endowed him in Vienna. It seemed he could not endure another moment in the same city as Klein, and required complete freedom to operate on his own. Even though Budapest was somewhat of a medical backwater at the time, his friends felt completely betrayed. They had shaken their reputations on supporting him, and now he had left them in the lurch. In the Budapest hospitals, where he now worked, Semmelweis instituted in his disinfection policy with such a rigor and tyrannical insistence that he cut the mortality rates, but aligned almost all of the doctors and nurses he worked with. More and more people were turning against him. He had forced upon everyone his novel ideas on disinfection, but without books or proper experiments to go back them up, it seemed that he was merely promoting himself or obsessed with some fanciful idea of his own creation. The vehemence with which he insisted on its truth only called more attention to the lack of scholarly rigor to back it up. Doctors speculated about the possible causes of his success, cutting the incidence of childbed fever. Finally, in 1860, under pressure from the colleges yet again, he decided to write a book that would explain his theory in full. But he was finished with it. Should have been relatively small volume, had bloomed into a 600-page diatribe that had been impossible to read. It was hopelessly repetitive and convoluted. His arguments were turned into polemics as he learned the doctors who had opposed him and who were therefore murderers. During such passages, his writing became almost apocalyptic. Now his opponents came out of the woodwork. He had committed himself to writing and had done such a bad job that they could poke holes through his arguments or merely call attention to his violent tone, which was self-damning enough. His former allies did not rely to his cause. They had come to hate him. His behavior seemed increasingly grandiose and erratic until his employees at the hospital had to dismiss him. Virtually penniless, was abandoned by almost everyone. He felt ill and died in 1865 at the age of 47. B. As a medical student at the University of Padua in Italy in 1602, the Englishman William Harvey, 1578 1657, began to entertain doubts about the whole conception of the heart and its functions as an organ. What he had been taught in school was based on the theories of the 2nd century Greek physician Galen, which started that same blood was manufactured by the liver and some in the heart and was transported by the veins and absorbed by the body, supplying it with nutrition. According to the theory, his blood flowed ever so slowly from the liver and the heart to various parts of the body that needed it, but it did not flow back. It was merely consumed. What troubled Harvey was how much blood in the body contained. How could it possibly produce and consume so much liquid? Over the ensuing years, his career prospered, culminating in the appointment as the royal physician to King James I. During these times, he continued to ponder the same question about blood and the role of the heart. And by the year 1618, he had come up with a theory. Blood flows to the body not slowly but rapidly, the heart acting as a pump. Blood is not produced and not consumed. Instead, it circulates continually. The problem with this theory was that he had no direct means of verifying it. At the time, to open a heart of a human and study it, it would spell instant death. It only means available for research was vivisection of animals. However, this would behave erratically and pump far too rapidly. The mechanics of a heart were complex, and for Harvey, that could only be detected through controlled experiments, such as using elaborate tourniquets on human veins, and could never be observed directly with the eyes. After many such controlled experiments, Harvey felt certain he was correct, but he knew it would have to carefully strategize his next step. His theory was radical. It would overrun many concepts, but anatomy had been accepted as fact for centuries. He knew that to publish his results so far would only stir up enmity and create many enemies for himself, and so thinking deeply about people's natural reluctance to accept new ideas, he decided to do the following. He delayed publishing the result of his findings, waited until he had firmed up his theory and amassed more evidence. In the meantime, he had involved his colleagues in further experiments and dissections, always eliciting their opinions. Increasing numbers of them were impressed and supported his new theory, slowly winning most of them to his side. In 1627, he was appointed the highest position of the College of Physicians, virtually ensuring him of employment for the rest of his life and freeing him from the worry that his theory would jeopardize his livelihood. As a court physician, first to James I and then to Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625, Harley worked diligently to gain royal favor. He played the court diplomat and avoided aligning himself with any faction or becoming involved in any intrigues. He behaved humbly and with self-deception. He confided his discoveries to the king early to gain his trust and support. In the country, there was a young man who had severely broken his ribs on the left side of his chest, leaving a cavity through which one could see and touch the heart. He brought the young man to the king's court and used him to demonstrate to Charles the nature of the heart's connections and expansions, and how the heart worked as a pump of the blood. Finally, in 1628, he published the results of his years of work, opening the book with a very clever dedication to Charles I, most senior king. The animal's heart is the basis of life. Its chief member, the sun of the microscope. On the heart, all its activity depends from the heart, and all its liveliness and strength arise. Equally is the king the basis of this kingdom. The sun of the microscope of the heart is of the state from From him all power arises and all grace stems. The book naturally created a stir, particularly on the continent where Harvey was less known. Opposition primarily came from older physicians who could not reconcile themselves with a theory that was so completely overturned the idea of anatomy. So the numerous publications that came out to discredit his ideas, Harvey remained mostly silent. On occasional attack from eminent physicians would cause him to write personal letters in which he very politely yet thoughtfully refused their ideas. As he had foreseen, the strength of his position within the medical profession and the court, and with great amount of evidence he had accumulated over the years, which was clearly outlined in his book, the theory slowly gained acceptance. By the time of Harvey's death in 1657, his work had become accepted part of the medical doctrine and practice. As his friend Thomas Hobbes would write, Harvey was the only man I know who conquered envy, hath established a new doctrine in his lifetime. The common historical accounts on Semmelweis and Harvey reveal our tendency to ignore the critical role of social intelligence in all fields, including the sciences. For instance, most versions of Semmelweis' story emphasize the tragic short-sightedness of men like Klein, who pushed the noble-minded young Hungarian over the edge. With Harvey, they emphasize his theoretical brilliance as the singular case of his success, but in both cases, social intelligence played a key role. Semmelweis completely ignored it necessary. Such considerations annoyed him. All that mattered was the truth. But in his zeal, he unnecessarily aliened Klein, who had faced other disagreements with students before, but never to such a degree. Through constant arguing, Semmelweis had Klein to the point of having to fire him, and thus lost an important position within a university from which he could spread the ideas. Consumed with his battle with Klein, he failed to express his theory in a clear and responsible form, displaying a monumental disregard for the importance of pursuing others. If he had merely devoted his time to make his case in writing, he could have saved far more lives in the long run. Harvey's success, on the other hand, was greatly due to social intelligence, social alliance. He understood that even scientists must pay the co-writer. He involved others in his work, making them emotionally attached to his theory. He published his result in a thoughtful, well-resorted, and easy-to-read book, and he quietly allowed his book to speak for itself, knowing that by asserting himself after its publication, he would merely call the attention to the person and not work. He did not give fuel to the foolishness of others by engaging in petty battles, and the opposition of his theories withered away on its own. Understand, your work is the single greatest means at your disposal from expressing your social intelligence. By being efficient and detail-oriented in what you do, you demonstrate that you're thinking of the group at large and advising its cost. By making what you write or present clear and easy to follow, you show the care for the audience or public at large. By involving other people in your project and gracefully accepting their feedback, you reveal your comfort with the group dynamic. Work that is solid also protects you from the political conniving and malevolence of others. It's hard to argue with the results you produce, and you're expecting the pressures of political maneuvering within the group. Do not lose your head and become consumed with all the pettiness. By remaining focused and speaking silkily through your work, you will both continue to raise your skill level and stand out among the others who make a lot of noise and produce nothing.